This week's video isn't so much about making pots, but rather how I fix those where the glaze has melted off the pot during the firing and fused it to the kiln shelf. Thus, I apologise in advance for all the loud, scratchy noises this video will contain. I don't normally use waddings to prop my pots up during the firing, but for any vessel where I think the glaze could potentially move, I do. I make this stuff myself from 50% china clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate, and it's stuck on the bottoms of pots to raise them up slightly, or in between the lid and body of a jar. Essentially, in both cases it creates a buffer. When on the bottoms of pots, it creates an air gap where the glaze can melt and flow without sticking to the shelf. But if it does move beyond these, which is rare, it will of course still stick the pot to the shelf. But hopefully not too much of the actual stoneware of the pot should be in contact with it, which means any glaze that does stick is relatively easy to tidy up. For most of my feldspathic crackle glazes, I don't use this, as the glaze stays exactly where it's put, except when it's applied extremely thickly or is overfired. These pots go directly on the shelf, whereas those with glazes that are less stable are raised up on these waddings. Obviously, you won't see if they have any effect until after the firing, so that's where we'll pick this story back up. In my kiln, it tends to be the pots on the uppermost shelves where the temperature is the hottest that are the most affected. But this mossy green glaze, which I've been using a lot more of recently, is far more susceptible to running and sticking to the shelf. Even if I place it lower down in the kiln and raise the pots up on waddings, there's still been a good number of them that have stuck, and it's how I deal with these pots that I'll show you in this video. Once the kiln has cooled down enough, it can be cracked open and the pots inspected. Here's an example of a glaze that was far too fluid and really stuck to the kiln shelf. I need to get to grips with glazing porcelain, as I've not had the best luck. I know what the solution is, and that's to glaze it more thinly, but despite this pot being wadded, the glaze flowed all over the bottom, spilling onto the kiln shelf and fusing it firmly in place. Sometimes the damage is so severe that I can't really fix it in any meaningful way. Thus, this piece was smashed to shards, which I'll collect and hold on to, so that a mosaic maker can eventually collect them and use them. And thankfully, none of the pots I'm going to fix in this video stuck nearly as badly, so they shouldn't be too difficult to mend. Most of these waddings either come off when you lift the pot up, or they pop off with just a tiny amount of pressure. Sometimes though, they're engulfed by glaze, and thus the entire lot will have to be carefully ground away with both the Dremel and diamond grinding discs. Yet, if the glaze is caught in that air gap, you get these lovely round globular runs of glaze that often have very intense colours within them. But as I've fired so many pieces, there's always going to be a few casualties. And here they are. The mugs should all be relatively easy to clean, as I only have to grind one part of the foot, but the bowl, as it's stuck in a few places, is going to be far trickier. As with all of these pots, the danger is, when you're grinding them, that you accidentally mark some other part of the vessel, scratching the foot or the glaze unnecessarily. I don't mind leaving marks where the glaze has been cleaned up, but if you damage another portion of the pot that was pristine, then you're only really making things worse. You can see where the glass is gathered into a thick band on the foot, and then in places where it became too thick, the tension breaks and it continues moving downward onto the shelf. So, in order to fix this, I'm going to be using a Dremel with one of these pink drill bits. The green ones work really well too. In fact, I think they're made for stone and glass, whereas these pink ones are for things like metal, but they still do a good job. I'm still using the ones that came with the grinder itself, and as this is something I do relatively infrequently, I haven't purposefully bought a set of grinding bits yet. I'm also going to be using these diamond grinding discs, which are made by Diamondcore Tools. There's a rough disc and a fine disc, and I attach them to the wheel by pressing them against this sticky pad. In order to get it to stick, I dampen the wheel a touch, and I really do mean a little bit. You don't want to overwet it, as otherwise it just slides all over the place. I then take the disc and press it onto this, tap center it, and then press it down. If you don't have one of these sticky pads, you can use a bit of chamois leather, or simply throw a pad of clay, dry it out until leather hard, and then press this into it. Before I begin grinding properly, I'll snap the waddings off that aren't fused in place with glaze. This one was pretty stuck in place, so I used this tungsten carbide tipped stone carver to crack as much of it off as I could. With that being said, I don't recommend doing this if the waddings can pluck away at the clay body underneath. I'm fairly confident with the materials I use that it won't, but better safe than sorry if you're new to tidying up your pots like this. All that's left to grind away now are these two pools of glaze that wrap themselves around the footring. Whenever I grind, I make sure the wheel is wet. This does multiple things. It acts as a coolant, a lubricant, it moves the build-up of debris out of the way, and it helps to keep the dust down. Perhaps the most important thing I bear in mind when grinding like this is to simply take it slowly and to never push down too hard or try and remove too much material in one go. After spending some time grinding, I dunk the foot in water to wash away the build-up of dust and to keep everything spinning smoothly. This is what I see as I grind, and it's why I crouch down next to the wheel so that I can really see at eye level what I'm actually doing. The waddings and the backwash tend to grind away quite easily, but the glass itself can be more stubborn. It's also quite brittle, and it can, if you aren't careful, snap away in chunks, tearing away more than you'd like. When doing this, I tend to work on one section at a time, and together with grinding it back to be flush with the body and the foot, I'm also really concentrating on not accidentally grinding another portion of the foot, especially a pristine part of it, as this can immediately ruin the piece, rendering it a second or even a third. That's often why I switch to this red one, as I can more easily grind on the edge of the disc, meaning that the other half, the part that I absolutely don't want to grind, is over the red section of the disc and can't make contact with the diamonds, thus decreasing the chance you accidentally grind it. Another important thing to note is that I don't do all of the grinding on these discs, as after a certain point, as you get closer and closer to the foot, you can't really see what you're doing, and it's at that point that I switch to using the Dremel. Pretty much all the same rules apply when using this. I keep the area I'm working on wet, I never press too firmly against the glass, and I take it really slowly. You'll notice as I grind, I'm constantly feeling the area I've just worked on, as my goal when doing this isn't to get rid of any last remnant of glaze on the foot. Instead, I'm just working the surface back until it's completely flush. This occasionally means I actually leave a touch of glass on the surface, provided when I run my finger over it, it feels wonderfully smooth. I'm also, again, taking this to about 99% completion when doing this, and for that last bit of sanding, I'll do it by hand with some diamond polishing pads. In my opinion, as long as this is done well, the vessel itself is still a first, and it can be sold at full price. Yet, if grinding is done poorly and excess glaze and clay has been scratched unnecessarily, then it renders the piece a second. As I get closer to the final finish, I increase the speed of the grinder and I use more water, as this tends to leave a smoother finish. You can hear that change in pitch here. In one way, having the three distinct facets on the bottoms of these makes them easier to grind, as I'm following those shapes all the way around the foot, as compared to, say, a foot that was entirely rounded, as in that instance you're sort of lacking some kind of guide. And here's the final step, a quick polish with one of these diamond pads. I begin with the 120 grit, and then move on to using the 200. Doing this just takes everything to a lovely glassy finish, and again I dip these in water before using them. I'm also careful to not overgrind the bottom. This is where you remove the flashed colour left on the stoneware clay, revealing the darker grey tones underneath. It works with porcelain as it doesn't quite flash in the same way, but with many stonewares I feel like you're losing some of the character the clay has. The piece is then given a good wash, and then I set it to one side to dry. And with that, we can move on to the mug, which is an easier vessel to grind in a way, as only a small portion of the glaze ran in comparison to the bowl. The only difficulty is, as the glaze has run just underneath the handle, it's relatively easy to accidentally grind it, as it can be so close to the grinding disc. It's almost there. There's probably about a millimetre or so of glass protruding, which I still need to grind back flush, in line with the rest of the clay body. I also want to quickly show you what happens if you accidentally catch a portion of the foot you didn't intend to. So I chose a sacrificial ancient cup to demonstrate this on. As you can see, there are some pretty clear gouges left in the stoneware. It's cut through the flashed surface, revealing the grey body underneath, and it doesn't look great. The other thing that can accidentally happen is the Dremel's bit catches the glaze and skitters across it. All this takes is one moment and lack of concentration, and as the bit is spinning, often when you do catch it, it does this. It drags itself across the surface, leaving a mark you'll never be able to repair. Yes, depending on the glaze it can be quite subtle of course, but again, in my opinion, it renders the piece a second. The flat planes really help, and again, as I grind I'm constantly feeling the area. Obviously don't do this if the glass is still quite sharp and dangerous, but at this point you should be able to gently run your finger over it, and what I'm looking for as I run my finger from left to right over this mark is to feel no noticeable difference, and it should be almost entirely flush with the stoneware on the bottom. Of course, all of this is a skill. Just like throwing pots or trimming them or glazing them, grinding pieces carefully and polishing them without inflicting extra damage is a skill that you can only really learn through trial and error and plenty of practice. In fact, during my apprenticeships, I must have ground thousands and thousands of pots like this. These are the diamond pads I use, by the way, which again are made by Diamondcore Tools. They've worked really wonderfully over the years, but they're getting a bit worn nowadays, and with the piece on the left I think I really need to glue the corners back down soon. And now at this point, as I run my thumb over it, I can't feel any remnant of where the glaze once was. Without filming, this process is of course much faster, and a mug like this takes about 4 or 5 minutes from beginning to end. What isn't great about the way I do it is the awkward position as I'm crouched on the floor. In an ideal world, I'd have a wheel that's raised up, so it's more or less eye level, but as I do this so infrequently, it's not really worth making that setup. And here's the finished pieces, which now thankfully sit flat. You can of course still see the damage on the foot, but on these pieces I see it as a remnant of their journey. They're sort of like where the waddings were anyway, as those also tend to leave ghostly prints on the foot ring itself. And if you're doing something like wood firing or soda firing, these more intensely ground and polished sections on the bottoms of pots are pretty much present on every single object you make. And like I mentioned earlier, as long as they're dealt with in an appropriate manner, and you don't expand on how damaged the piece is, then I actually really quite like these marks. To the level where I'm almost sometimes tempted to glaze a piece entirely, place it on waddings, fire it, and then grind them back, just so I'm left with these small patches on the foot ring itself. As for the mugs, I really love this piece with the blue streak in the handle, which is something I've not had happen with this mossy green glaze before. By the way, obviously these ground areas always look better when they're damp, and so sometimes, and if they're on the bottoms of pots, I very lightly brush them with some stone sealant. It's meant for outdoor patios, and once dry, it practically preserves it in this damp state. Anyhow, this is just one way of tidying up the bottoms of your pots. I know that there are lots of different techniques and tools that you can use, and if you, say, have a very different technique that also works wonderfully, I'd love to hear about it, as I'm always interested to learn about how other potters go about doing part of the job that's often unspoken about. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch, and, like always, I'll see you next week.